The morning Sarah Chen was dragged from the Imperial Dragon Sanctum. She had been teaching Xerion, the Emperor's prize Crimson Drake, to respond to whistled commands. The massive creature, nearly 12 feet of scaled muscle and intelligent amber eyes, had just successfully performed a complex aerial maneuver based solely on a sequence of human musical notes. Emperor Valkyris himself had been watching from his observation platform, his insectoid features betraying what might have been curiosity. For 3 years, Sarah had served as the primary handler for his collection of engineered dragons, creatures the Vex had bred for beauty and status, but which she had discovered possessed far greater intelligence than their creators realized. Fascinating, the Emperor had chittered in his modulated voice. The specimen responds more efficiently to your methods than to neural interface commands. Sarah had smiled, running her hand along Xerion's neck where bioluminescent scales pulsed in response to her touch. They're not just specimens, Your Majesty. They're individuals with their own personalities and preferences. Xerion here prefers melodic patterns in minor keys. That conversation felt like a lifetime ago as Vex security forces escorted her through the pristine corridors of the Imperial Palace. High Castellan Zectrix led the procession, his golden ceremonial plates clicking with each step. By order of the Grand Council, he announced formally, the human Sarah Chen is hereby expelled from Imperial service and banished from all Vex territories for corrupting Imperial property and exceeding the bounds of her species-designated role. Sarah's protests fell on deaf auditory organs. Within hours, she found herself aboard a transport vessel bound for the outer colonies, her personal belongings reduced to a single bag and a data pad containing her research notes on dragon behavior, research the Vex had deemed too dangerous to leave in alien hands. As the transport ship jumped to hyperspace, Sarah stared out at the stars and made a silent promise. She would find a way back to her dragons, and when she did, the Vex would learn exactly how dangerous an underestimated human could be. Meanwhile, in the sterile chambers of the Grand Council, High Castellan Zectrix was already planning what he called preventative measures against the human colonies that might harbor similar dangerous ideas about cooperation with other species. None of them could have predicted that their solution would become their greatest nightmare. 3 months after Sarah's exile, the Grand Council of the Vex Imperium convened in their luminescent chamber, its vaulted ceiling alive with bioluminescent panels that cast eerie shadows across the assembled insectoid forms. High Castellan Zectrix's mandibles clicked thrice, the formal signal for urgent proceedings. The human problem has escalated, he announced, his ceremonial thorax plates gleaming. Around the central projection table, a dozen bureaucratic forms chittered nervously, their exoskeletons adorned with the metallic inlays that marked their ranks. A holographic display materialized, showing surveillance data from Beta Colony 9. The images were grainy, but unmistakable, humans working alongside creatures that looked remarkably like the Emperor's dragons, but different. Larger. More complex neural patterns. And most disturbing of all, they seemed to be responding to human commands with an intelligence that made the Vex's own engineered specimens look primitive by comparison. Our intelligence indicates, continued War Director Harkes, his battle-scarred carapace gleaming with fresh polish, that the exiled handler has been sharing her methods with the colonists. They're not just training dragons, they're breeding them. Improving them. Subminister Vikol's thoracic plates expanded with indignation. The audacity of these mammals never ceases to appall. They take our generosity in allowing them to settle on the outer territories and use it to develop weapons against us. The assembled council clicked their mandibles in the formal pattern of administrative approval, all except for one figure in the corner. Historian Valeth sat silently, his recording appendages whirring softly as he documented the proceedings. Unlike his colleagues, his carapace was unadorned save for a simple blue scholarly band. He had studied humans extensively, more extensively than anyone present would have deemed necessary. There is a solution, Zectrix continued, gesturing at tactical displays that showed orbital weapons platforms positioning themselves above Beta Colony 9. We eliminate the source of contamination before it can spread. The vote was unanimous, save for one abstention. As the council dispersed to implement their preventative action, Valeth remained at his post, his inner eyelids flickering rapidly, a habit his superiors found distasteful but tolerated. He had studied enough human history to recognize the pattern unfolding before him. The dangerous complacency that followed overwhelming force applied against a seemingly weaker opponent. In his files, he had countless examples of what happened when humans were pushed too far. But his warnings had always fallen on deaf auditory organs. Within hours, 13 orbital platforms aligned above the unsuspecting human sanctuary, their cobalt weapons charging with that characteristic hum that preceded the iron ozone smell of scorched earth. The attack came without warning at dawn on Beta Colony 9. 13 orbital platforms rained cobalt fire upon the sleeping settlement, their weapons discharging with the characteristic iron ozone stench of scorched probability fields. In less than 10 minutes, 28,413 human colonists were reduced to ash and memory. The colony had been beautiful once, habitat domes arranged in concentric circles around a central hub, surrounded by carefully cultivated farmlands that had taken decades to adapt to the alien soil. Now those domes lay shattered like fragile eggshells, their contents exposed to the toxic alien atmosphere. Bodies lay contorted in positions of final terror. In what had been a school, tiny figures huddled together where educators had uselessly tried to shield their charges with their own bodies. Sensor drones skimmed the devastation with methodical thoroughness, cataloging the destruction with the same dispassion they might apply to a weather survey. In the Grand Council chamber, Administrator Victari examined casualty reports with obvious satisfaction. "The paperwork on this one will be refreshingly minimal," he remarked, his feeding appendages twitching with amusement. "I've filed Form XR 7891-D for munitions expenditure, only 3 signatures required instead of the usual 17. High Castellan Zectrix raised a nectar sack in celebration. To efficient preventative measures, he toasted, and to the continued security of the Imperium. Efficiency and security, the Council responded in practiced unison, their mandibles clicking in ritual cadence. Only historian Valeth remained silent, his recording appendages capturing every self-congratulatory word. What his colleagues didn't know, what they had been too arrogant to investigate, was that Sarah Chen hadn't been on Beta Colony 9 when it was destroyed. She had been on Kepler Station, 3 systems away, when the news reached her. The message came through emergency channels, grainy footage of her friends, her research colleagues, her surrogate family, reduced to carbonized shadows on alien soil. Sarah watched the footage in the cargo hold of a smuggler's ship, surrounded by 47 dragons of various species, not the pretty, docile creatures the Vex bred for status, but their wild cousins. Powerful, intelligent, and now bonded to humans who understood their true potential. As the last images flickered across her data pad, showing a child-stuffed dragon toy amid the ruins, Sarah's expression hardened into something that would have terrified the Vex Council members, had they bothered to study human psychology beyond their basic xenological assessments. "They want to see what humans can do when we stop playing by their rules," she whispered to Zirian, the Emperor's former prize dragon who had somehow found his way to her ship. The great beast's amber eyes glowed with an intelligence that had nothing to do with Vex engineering. Behind them, in the shadows of the cargo bay, dozens of other dragons stirred restlessly. And in the depths of space, more ships were gathering, human vessels that had been invisible to Vex sensors, carrying refugees, supplies, and most importantly, more dragons than the Imperium had ever imagined existed. The Vex had wanted to prevent a rebellion. Instead, they had just started a war. 6 months after the massacre at Beta Colony 9, the Vex Imperium received its first indication that their preventative action had not gone according to plan. It began with missing patrol ships along the outer territories. Vessels would simply vanish from sensor grids, leaving behind only faint energy signatures that Vex scientists couldn't identify. When search and rescue teams were dispatched, they found nothing but empty space and the occasional piece of debris that analysis showed had been subjected to temperatures exceeding any known weapon in the Imperial arsenal. High Castellan Zectrix convened emergency sessions of the Grand Council, but their discussions yielded only bureaucratic solutions to what was clearly a military problem. Intelligence reports spoke of anomalous energy patterns and unidentified biological signatures, but nothing concrete enough to plan a response. The answer came when the dragon fleet revealed itself. They emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Vex home system like something out of ancient mythology, hundreds of dragons flying in perfect formation through the void of space, their scales generating bioelectric fields that allowed them to survive in vacuum. Between them flew human ships, but not the crude transports the Vex remembered. These vessels were sleek, organic-looking craft that seemed to pulse with life. At the head of the formation, riding a dragon larger than any in the Emperor's collection, was Sarah Chen. But the woman who had once served as a humble handler now wore armor that seemed to flow like living metal, and her eyes held the cold fire of someone who had seen her people murdered and had spent months planning her response. Emperor Valkyries himself appeared on the communication channels, his modulated voice betraying what might have been fear. "The exile returns," he chittered. "Most irregular. Most concerning." Sarah's response was broadcast across every Vex frequency, ensuring that every citizen of the Imperium would hear her words, "Your Majesty. Your council killed my friends, my colleagues, my family. They called it preventative action. I call it murder. And I've come to collect the debt." The dragons around her roared in unison, a sound that somehow transmitted through space itself, vibrating through the hulls of Vex ships and causing their finely tuned systems to fluctuate. It was then that the Vex realized their fundamental error. They had assumed dragons were just animals to be controlled. They had never considered that dragons might be an intelligent species in their own right, one that had been waiting centuries for the right partner to help them reach the stars. As the dragon fleet advanced toward the heart of the Imperium, historian Valeth sat in his archives, his recording appendages working frantically. His colleagues had dismissed his warnings about human psychology, but the patterns were all there in the historical record. Humans, when pushed to their limits, didn't just fight back, they transformed themselves into something their enemies couldn't have imagined. The Vex had wanted to prevent contamination. Instead, they had created evolution itself. The Battle of Vex Prime lasted exactly 47 minutes. The Imperium's orbital defense platforms, the same ones that had reduced Beta Colony 9 to ash, fired their cobalt weapons at the approaching dragon fleet. The energy beams that should have incinerated the attackers instead seemed to be absorbed by the dragon's scales, which glowed brighter with each impact before redirecting the energy in focused bursts that tore through Vex ship hulls like paper. High Castellan Zectrix watched from the Grand Council chamber as his efficient preventative measures proved utterly useless against an enemy they had never bothered to understand. His ceremonial plates clicked frantically as tactical displays showed impossible readings, dragons moving through space at speeds that violated physics, human ships that regenerated damage faster than weapons could inflict it. How are they doing this? War Director Harkes chittered in panic as another orbital platform exploded in brilliant fire. The answer came from the most unexpected source. Historian Valeth stepped forward from his corner, his plain blue scholar's band gleaming in the chaos of the command center. "Because they learned," he said simply. "Humans don't just train animals, they form partnerships. They don't just use tools, they become one with them. And dragons." He paused, his inner eyelids flickering rapidly. Dragons were never animals at all. Through the chamber's viewing ports, they could see Sarah Chen approaching the palace aboard Zirian, the Emperor's former prize specimen. But the dragon that had once been content to perform simple tricks for imperial entertainment now moved with predatory grace, his amber eyes burning with intelligence that made the Vex look primitive by comparison. Emperor Valkyries met them in his throne room, his insectoid form trembling despite his attempts at imperial dignity. Sarah dismounted and walked forward, her bioarmor pulsing with the same rhythm as her dragon companion's heartbeat. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 28,413 murdered colonists. "You wanted to prevent contamination. You succeeded. You contaminated yourselves with genocide. The humans were becoming problematic," Valkyries chittered weakly. "Their influence on imperial property was concerning." Sarah smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Imperial property?" She turned to Zirian, who had been listening to every word. "What do you think about that designation, old friend?" The dragon's response came not in roars or chittering, but in perfect, crystalline speech that resonated through bioacoustic chambers the Vex hadn't even known existed. I think, little sister, that we have been patient long enough with these insects who believe intelligence belongs only to them. The revelation that dragons were not only sapient but had been conscious observers of their own subjugation for centuries broke the last of Vex resistance. Across the Imperium, other dragons began to speak, to reveal the hidden civilization they had maintained in secret, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Some Vex fought to the end, but most simply surrendered when they realized the scope of their misunderstanding. They had built an empire on the backs of a species more ancient and intelligent than themselves, and that species had been taking notes. A year later, Sarah stood in what had once been the Grand Council chamber, now converted into a joint human-dragon diplomatic center. The bioluminescent panels still glowed, but they were joined by new lighting systems that responded to both human visual spectrums and dragon bioelectric fields. Emperor Valkyrie, stripped of his titles but granted clemency, served as a historical advisor, one of the few Vex who had shown genuine curiosity about other species rather than mere desire to control them. High Castellan Zectrix and most of his council had been exiled to the outer territories, where they were learning firsthand what it meant to be refugees dependent on the mercy of others. Historian Valith had been appointed as the first Vex representative to the new Interspecies Council, his extensive records of human psychology finally being put to constructive use. The irony, Sarah remarked to Zirian as they watched ships from dozens of species arriving for the inaugural council session, is that they were right about contamination. It just wasn't the kind they expected. The great dragon, now wearing ceremonial armor that marked him as an ambassador of his people, turned his ancient eyes toward her. Indeed, little sister. They feared that human cooperation would spread to other species. They never imagined it would teach us to rediscover ourselves. Outside the great windows, the stars shone on a galaxy where intelligence was no longer the privilege of a single species, where cooperation had replaced subjugation, and where the greatest threat to tyranny had turned out to be the simple human belief that everyone deserved a chance to be more than what others expected them to be. The Vex had wanted to prevent their empire from changing. Instead, they had changed the galaxy itself. And in the archives of the new Interspecies Council, preserved for future generations to study, were the complete records of how an empire fell not to superior weapons or overwhelming force, but to the dangerous idea that friendship could transcend species, that intelligence came in forms beyond insectoid bureaucracy, and that the greatest power in the universe was not the ability to destroy, but the wisdom to understand. The end.